Hey, Mark, thank you for coming in. I've been looking at your background and it just is across so many different domains. It's just excellence and execution and innovation. And you're continue to drive that as well. So really such a pleasure to have this chat with you today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for hosting me here. I'm really kind of excited to share some of my background, and really my background is tied so closely into the organization that I work with. I've spent my entire career at Mayo Clinic, and it's one of the most innovative and inspiring places in the world. And so I'm happy to share some of that with you today.
Well, I'm going to ask some questions later on in our chat, and it's a dynamic chat, so conversation may go in all sorts of different directions. But one of the things is you've done so much across so many different areas. Can you maybe give me two, three, maybe even four milestones that shape
Yeah.
to where you are today? And it could be even starting at the age of four, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think everybody's, the story of where they end up is different. It's fun looking back to see where we all came from. And when I look back over my career, it really had three different phases. I started as a technologist. I just had this overwhelming love of technology. I'm a huge science fiction fan. My goal has always been to recreate the future that my favorite authors, described. My favorite authors are the masters, people like Philip Dick and Isaac Asimov. And, you know, I love that science fiction tracks innovation. So I really love how our field is developed. And now I read the new authors, people like N.K. Jemisin, who recently won 3 Hugos in a row. And C.J. Sherry has always been one of my favorites. So the second phase in my career really occurred when I moved into a first line management position. And I really saw that as an opportunity to leverage my passion and my skills and my many years of experience as a technologist to really try to do more. And at a certain point, you've really got to decide if you're going to continue to be an individual contributor or if you really want to leverage your capabilities through partnering with others. And that's what I decided I wanted to do. So I was fortunate at Mayo to move into several different first line leadership positions. So I started by managing our project development unit and led the creation of our first project management office back in about 2000 with a lot of help from other people. And then I managed our mechanical unit and our machine shop for a bit before returning to my roots, which was managing our electronics development unit. And I will say that taking over the mechanical engineering team was kind of critical to my own personal development. Having the experience of managing outside of your own discipline can be life-changing. Most managers in engineering start as really good technologists and then they end up managing people in the same discipline. And to have to manage outside of my discipline, that forced me to learn some different skills. And more importantly, it taught me that I needed to learn to trust the team. And that's a lesson that I've carried with me for forever. The third phase of my career was really this acceptance of a leadership as a leadership role in my organization. So about 10 years ago, I really started pursuing this leadership journey. And my reading changed from science and technology to leadership and emotional intelligence and developing culture and managing change. Those kinds of things became really important to me. So instead of reading about what science could do today, I started focusing about what science, technology, and organizations could do into the future. And I'm motivated by the same business authors really that most of us read: Stephen Covey, Simon Sinek, Daniel Goleman, Peter Drucker, Jim Collins. I love Good to Great because it really aligns with the lessons of humility that I learned when I was managing our mechanical unit and our machine shop. You know, I also really like futurists. So people like Klaus Schwab, who has written extensively about the fourth industrial revolution. And I really like reading Fareed Zakira and Richard Watson because I think they have really good thoughts on where organizations and really our whole world is going. I also spend a fair amount of time reading about some new technologies. I read about Eric Topol with AI because that's going to be a big kind of cornerstone of Mayo Clinic's movement into the future and folks like that. So it was this point that I decided I really needed to return to school for my MBA. And after completing my MBA, I started teaching leadership development and spent a lot of time thinking about how to use technology to really contribute to solving some of our biggest healthcare problems. So, that was the time in my career where I moved into a second line management position. And then within the last year, I finally taken over as leader of the engineering group at Mayo Clinic. So I've now been chair of engineering at Mayo for a little over a year, and this has really been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And, in particular, managing through the pandemic has been unexpectedly challenging and rewarding.
Well, that's a sort of an incredible history going back to your interest in, these sort of dominant science fiction authors. I'm just going to mine that a little bit. Like,
Uh,
you're a Star Trek fan, or Ridley Scott, or Tony Scott, or that kind of thing as well?
Sure, absolutely. I grew up watching Star Trek, so, that was, I still dream of a transporter, but, I really struggle with some of the kind of philosophical portions of it, because what really happens when you're transported? You kill one version and recreate another. I still haven't quite got the answer to that one.
And within that series, did you have a favorite, like Next Generation or Deep
Oh, it was
Space
the
Nine?
original, of course. Yeah, yeah, James T. Kirk. Yes,
I'm just
without a
thinking of
doubt.
those monsters, though, that you never compared to what we have now in terms of CGI and tech, right? So,
Yeah, sure, but I love the CGI and I love the tech, but I am a longtime reader, and it really comes down to the story, right? You've got to have the good story behind it, and that to me is more important than the CGI. And it does help, if they have good science as well. That's a real challenge with being an engineer and going to science fiction movies, is the science doesn't always make sense.
how about some of Ridley Scott's work? And he's got one right now that's, dropping, where you can do sort of back-to-back episodes. And anything in there that you like, or no?
Well, so I haven't seen the new one, but of course, Alien was a classic when it came out. That's definitely a Ridley Scott movie. If I think back at some of my favorites, Blade Runner has to be right up there. That was based on a Philip K. Dick book, who was also one of my favorites. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Terrific movie. So I do like those kind of shows.
So you talk about this sort of idea, mid-career, where you're getting used to sort of managing groups, and you're having diverse teams you have to manage as well. Have you ever done something called the JAS process? There's kind of this old IBM idea where the more diverse the team, and even if there's a bit of tension, that's okay, as long as you can manage it.
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the jazz process, but I definitely welcome the value of diversity. There's really nothing worse than a bunch of people that think the same. You know, that is not the way to come up with the best solution. You need people that have different approaches to things, and the value is really being able to kind of extract the good from ideas and build on it. It just doesn't work very well for somebody to have an idea and everybody to jump on and say, great idea, and then you go off and do it. I don't like that. I like somebody to have a good idea, and then talk about what'll work, what doesn't work, and eventually come around to a group consensus. But it's a consensus of a lot of people approaching it very, very different ways. And to me, that is the most kind of critical component of innovative thinking. And whether it's developing a new product, or whether it's doing process development, or even how you approach management to your staff, or responding to a pandemic, or creating a new strategic plan, you really need all of that. You need to have folks that don't all think the same way, who come together as a team. And I really think that's a hallmark of Mayo Clinic. It's one of the things that I think we have arguably done as well or better than any healthcare organization in the world. And I tell people it's not that everybody at Mayo Clinic is better than other folks. It's because we have this compelling vision, right, and mission that help us be better than who we are, individually. And that comes down to recognizing the potential of everybody who's part of your team.
Just prior to us sort of going live, you talked about this amazing history of the Mayo Clinic, I guess over 100 years. And it wasn't really about people care initially, right? Can you share a little bit about that with the audience?
Well, the history of Mayo is pretty interesting. We were founded in the cornfields of Minnesota back when it literally was cornfields. The father of the Mayo brothers came here, I think, in 1865 to Rochester, Minnesota, and it was a little town of about, horse and buggy town of about 4,000 or 5,000 people. It was his sons who started the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic was founded in 1889. It was the first nonprofit group practice of medicine in the world, and that was what we consider to be the Mayo brothers' first and probably most significant innovation. This idea of a group of physicians coming together to provide care for a patient instead of a patient going from physician to physician to try to manage that care. So a very different model, and that didn't exist prior to 1889. We've been fortunate that the culture and history of our founders are one that was based on constant education and learning. The Mayo brothers would travel the world, find out what was working the best, and they would bring that back. And then eventually they became teachers to the rest of the world. And so, that's kind of imbued our culture since our earliest days. And they brought engineering in. Engineering was created as part of Mayo Clinic in about 1915. So we've been around for over 105 years. And the reason we were brought here is because the equipment, the surgical equipment and things like that we were using, after the development of anesthesia, after the development of aseptic surgery, what we could do to help treat surgical patients changed dramatically because, the patients no longer would feel the operation, so we could take longer at it, but they also didn't get infected and die anymore. So, we were able to do a lot more with it. So instruments became more and more sophisticated. And so, 1915, we started by bringing in a group of machinists and technologists to create instruments. And then over the years, we continued to add new capabilities. I mentioned to you the history of medical innovation is amazing because, it started really with anesthesia and aseptic surgery. But in the 40s, we had the transistors. In the 50s, the integrated circuit. In the 60s, mini computers. In the 70s, the first commercial microprocessors. And you think about those technologies right now, we take them for granted, but 50 or 60 years ago, they were brand new, and the things we could do with them were new. And you think about that as the glory days of medical devices and healthcare because of the amazing changes that they brought on, until you take a look at the last 10 years and you realize, no, maybe we're in the glory days right now because you see the technologies that are making a difference today. We talked about artificial intelligence, which is going to be huge, but just our connected world, the way that's changing how we interact with patients and provide care. Our group is really involved with additive manufacturing. So we're doing a lot of 3D printing. We're working now with a new titanium printer to start doing custom implants for patients. Robotics is really starting to hit its stride. AI has finally reached the point where the combination of computational power, and access to these large data sets has allowed us to really start to leverage it in very powerful ways. So when you think about what the next 10 years is going to bring, I think it's going to be amazing. And it's hard not to be excited about being part of this.
It's interesting. I was invited to speak at South by Southwest, which is, some people internationally not realize it's sort of a really big conference centered out of Austin. And I spent an hour talking about medical innovation, but really the whole field of medicine, which is about a $9 trillion marketplace worldwide, that's been kind of late in the adoption of some of the, the transformative tech that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting now there's this kind of acceleration, and I think the pandemic has something to do with that. if you're going to look at patient care and patient assisted with AI and 5G and remote
Mhm.
telemedicine, and then using robots, as you indicated, or even using the big data AI analytics platforms for materials, vaccines, contact tracing, and so on. All of that you would think would be rolling out over the next 10 years, it's just happened now.
Mhm.
And even this perhaps delayed by radiologists and actually saying, yeah, we can use imaging and, and we're going to accept it in the use of AI, not to replace us, but to help augment, because they're under so much stress in terms of the amount of analysis they have to do, and then getting sort of AI assistance. So you must be really happy at some of these transformations that are occurring, because you're also chair of engineering for the Mayo Clinic, right? So,
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, about a year ago, we put together our new roadmap to the future, our 2030 strategic plan. And some of these new technologies were core components of that plan. And healthcare has been slow to adapt to some of them. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that we're a highly regulated industry, and highly regulated industries move slower. It's simply a fact of having to deal with the regulations. You look at HIPAA requirements and things like that have constrained us from being able to take advantage of the tremendous amounts of data that are generated. And then we've got some very large entrenched players as well. You think of the companies that provide the EMRs, you know, it's dominated by two or three companies. And, you know, of course, they're dealing with regulations. So innovation sometimes tends to move slow, but I think it's to the point where it's primed to happen. When I look at the 2030 plan that Mayo Clinic has put together, the way I try to explain it to people is we are trying to disrupt our own business before somebody else disrupts it for us, right? So we're taking a look and saying, what does healthcare look like in 10 years or 20 years, right? Does it look like it does today? And I don't think anybody is saying, yes, it does. You know, we're expecting we're going to see more people cared for at home. We're going to see more people cared for in community hospitals. You know, we're looking at how do we take these less acute cases away from these massive critical care centers, but how do we bring people together into those centers when we need this complex, multidisciplinary kind of care? And so, you know, we're looking at, you know, how do we undercut our own business by providing care for people in community hospitals and at home? And as Mayo Clinic, we want to be part of that. You know, we know what our mission is. We know what our primary value is. Our primary value is the needs of the patient come first, and we live that every day. And so we feel like we are the right people to be doing that. And so we're putting a ton of effort into that. Now, it's funny that you mentioned the pandemic. I talked to you about this a little bit earlier. We have this 2030 plan that we put in place, and this was led by our CEO, Dr. Ferrugia, and we have a platform president, Dr. Halamka, and the two of them have both talked about how the 2030 plan was thought to be really, really aggressive. And the pandemic has taught us that maybe it wasn't quite so aggressive after all. Maybe our 2030 plan is really a 2022 plan, because a lot of the obstacles have been removed. If you think about things like remote patient visits, and over the last few months, you know, we've seen a skyrocketing in the number of remote patient visits. So for us, it went from 0.5% up to 40 or 50%. And now it's dropped down to about 10%, which is where we think it'll stay for the indefinite future. Well, that's a 20-fold increase in 6 months. So that's a huge difference. And why we were able to do that is because the pandemic put pressure on the regulatory systems, on the healthcare providers, on the patients, and on the physicians, and pushed all of them to accept this change that would otherwise have taken a lot longer to occur. And that's kind of a fundamental thing around change management, right? To put these things in place, all of these systems have to change, and they're highly interrelated, so they have to change at the same time. So sometimes, you know, it really helps to have a, you know, kind of an event like that opens people up for the kinds of change that we know is coming anyway.
yeah, and I guess what you're saying too, it's the interdisciplinary change. You know, it's a system-wide change, and medicine is
Mm-hmm.
so complex with all of these sometimes silos. our
Yeah,
current planet reset, that's what I call it, is
yeah,
actually forcing all of the components of the system to work together and accelerate, right? So,
yeah. I'll give you a perfect example of this is a healthcare provider. You come into the office and they have a visit with you. Okay, great. You go across the state lines and have a televisit. That doesn't work anymore because you're not licensed in that state. So those are some of the kinds of things that we have to deal with from a regulatory standpoint to be able to effectively provide remote care. And that's just one of, 100 or maybe 1,000 of these small little things that has to be addressed. Insurance companies have to feel comfortable that they're getting the value and be willing to reimburse it. The regulatory side has to change, the practice side has to change, scheduling has to change, the way a healthcare organization approaches treating patients has to change. And so there's a lot of moving parts.
what's happened in this planet reset is it's changed behavior. And you mentioned that, right? Yeah. Sort of these telemedicine aspects going up to 50% now, maybe stabilizing around 10%.
Mm-hmm.
But that means a fundamental change in behavior, and consumers have moved online in e-commerce, or you have digital transformation occurring across companies, because
Mm-hmm.
for them to do well, they're going to have to be more digitally integrated. Do you think that those kind of fundamental changes are going to be really permanent, or do you think it's going to go back to some like it was in 2019?
Yeah, well, I don't think we'll ever go back to the way it was in 2019, and mostly because many of these changes are in line with the direction that organizations were moving. Now, clearly, there's going to be a rebound. There's already been a rebound, from 40 or 50% remote visits to 10. But the fact is, these things make so much sense that there's going to be a lot of sustaining. We're seeing the same thing in organizations that are sending their folks home to work remotely. And what we're finding in a very short period of time is that we can be very, very productive in a remote work environment. It's forced us, again, to put all these pieces together, the tools, getting everybody learning how to use Zoom, having all meetings occur virtually, right? All of these pieces have come together. Now, there's going to be some rebound once we have a vaccine, once we're less concerned about the pandemic, and people will be going back into the offices, but they won't go back to where it was before. There's going to be a huge change where a significant number of folks are going to work remotely some portion of their time where previously they weren't, and others are going to be working remotely on a permanent basis. Now, you think about some of the organizational changes that have to occur to support that. And it's going to be really interesting from kind of a social dynamics standpoint, because how do you create the kind of loyalty and culture and interrelated and interconnectedness, the innovation? How do you make these things happen with a distributed workforce? Many organizations have worked on this and been successful, but it's not something that's been applied across the board. So we've got a lot of things to learn. There are things we have to be very intentional about in order to make sure that we preserve what works while moving to a new style of working together.
So, what do you think the world's going to look like, let's say in 2025? So, not, far term, but sort of kind of
Mm-hmm.
near midterm. So, for example, you had Elon Musk, he had the pig with the implants and with Neuralink. So it gives you sort of a picture of this brain interface, and the wires are so thin that you're not getting the scarring. And he even has a surgical robot that can implant them. Or I'm just thinking of CRISPR 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
Where you can do nucleic acid gene code segment sort of work, or targeting of RNA towards RNA diseases, or you can do targeting of RNA and protein to in vivo RNA changes within humans, or this idea of protein folding and a lot of the work that's going on in there, and using things like maybe even quantum computing or supercomputing
Mhm.
and AI for sure. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Electrotherapeutics. I mean, there's just so much microbiome and what's occurring there. New kinds of care. You know, for example, ketamine and or psilocybin and so on. And dot 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 dot. Where do you see things going? And by 2025, and some of the big changes that are going to be disrupted planetary wise.
Well, you know, you've just pointed out why the next decade is going to be so incredibly exciting. Um, you know, it's really hard to imagine where we might be in 5 years. And, you know, 5 years doesn't sound like very long. But if you think back about, you know, what kind of technology advances there have been over the last decade, for example, the first iPhone came out in 2007. And arguably that has made an incredible change and impact on society. You know, the whole social media phenomena, you know, has occurred in basically the last 12 years. So the changes that we've seen as a society over the last decade, I think, are going to pale in comparison to what we see over the next decade, because change continues to accelerate, right? You know, it took us 2 million years to go from being, you know, hunter gatherers to moving into an agrarian kind of society. And it took us, you know, 10 years to develop this kind of social media dominated world. So the things you talk about, you know, and I'm not an expert in most of these technologies, but, you know, you think about CRISPR and it's just kind of broken open our ability to modify the genome, and what that brings for us, you know, we don't know, but I have to believe it's going to be amazing, you know, using it to, you know, cure various types of genetic disorders. We're using it right now to help develop vaccines to treat help prevent the coronavirus, you know, so just huge opportunities. There's AI, which we've talked about, and I think that there's tremendous potential for AI to help increase the quality of healthcare, and also in many different fields. One of the things I'm personally excited about, because my group doesn't work in the cloud, we don't work with big data and data analytics. We're more excited about edge AI. So, you know, after the AI engineers figure out an algorithm, how do we move it down to the patient bedside, right? You think about, you know, like one of the self-driving cars, the Google car or Teslas or something like that. Those are real-time AI systems, right? We don't have time to send the data up to a big server somewhere, have it do some calculations, send you back a note saying, hey, that's a dog on the road. It has to do that in real time. So I think, you know, the computational power that we have, you know, available at our fingertips gives us huge capabilities. We're really excited about, you know, the creation of medical devices at the point of care. And I think, you know, sensor development is going to fit into that. The area we're pushing forward the hardest on right now is custom implants. So doing point of care printed implants for patients. You know, I think most of us are probably familiar with, you know, grandpa or grandma had to go in and get a hip replacement or a knee replacement. And these are kind of standardized implants. There's 4 or 5 different sizes. You pick the size that fits the best and you get pretty darn good outcomes. But you think about a patient that has cancer in the face and has to have some kind of reconstruction done. That's different for every single patient, every single one. So if you can take CT images, MRI images of the patient and create the implant you need to reconstruct the patient's face after the surgery, or somebody that's been in an accident and you have to start trying to piece some of the bones together and things like that. I think there's just some tremendous power that's going to be coming out of our ability to print those implants right on site. The surgeon is able to come and interact with the radiologist and the engineer to come up with the best solution for that patient. So, you know, we're very, very excited about some of those kind of technologies too.
Yeah, and in fact, you're at the center of this because the Mayo Clinic's pretty famous. So,
Yes.
and you're chairing the engineering group, and you're also the assistant professor of biomedical engineering in the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science, and you're a fellow of the Mayo Clinic Academy of Educational Excellence. I mean, you're so embedded in all of these areas of Mayo, but also related and aligned areas related to Mayo.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe let's go out 10 years. Or is that too far? Can you imagine what it's
Well, that that's an exercise we are going through too, because you have to ask yourself, there's huge capital investments in healthcare systems. So if you're trying to figure out where to invest your money, you have to ask yourself, what does the hospital of the future look like and forget 10 years, 20 years, right? In 2040, because these capital investments last for 50 years. We build a new building, it's going to be around for a long time. What does that look like 20 years from now? Right? Well, how will we be treating patients then? And that's one of the things we have to be working to predict. And because we can't design buildings to meet the needs today because they won't meet the needs in the future. So we in a sense have to be futurists. And when we look at it, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of things are we going to be doing? What kind of patients are we going to be treating? Where are most patients going to be getting their care, and what kind of care are they going to be getting? And what we're seeing is that we're living in a distributed, interconnected world. And people like you and I 20 years from now, we're going to want to continue to be healthy and be able to maintain ourselves in our own home. 30 or 40 years from now, we're going to want to be able to do that. So what are the technologies we need in our homes to allow us to do that? And then what is this graduated scale, right? Because if I can't do everything in my home, I want to step back to my community hospital. What kind of care do I need there? Or what kind of care do I need in the critical care hospital, these tertiary care hospitals, but how do I get back home as quickly as possible? There's this interesting concept around a virtual hospital. So you think about it, it doesn't have a physical presence. Okay, you send the patients home, you put monitoring equipment on them, you do have a central site where you can watch them. The days of house calls went away. I think it's coming back, right? You're going to start seeing providers going to people's homes and doing the checks, checking bloods, checking vitals, doing the things that need to happen. So I think we're going to see a much more consumer centric, patient-centric model of care that's distributed. And so you look at, how do we provide health care in our community? How do we provide it in another state? Physicians have been leaving rural areas in droves for the last 20 or 30 years. This gives us a way to get healthcare back into those areas. And then you take it another step. And how do we get it into some of the less developed areas of the world so that we can provide remote care, high quality care for people everywhere? And, then the next step, is to go talk to Elon Musk and say, we also want to do this on the mission to Mars. How about that? How do we provide care for astronauts that are going on a 4-year mission to Mars? What if somebody needs surgery, right? How do we take and provide some kind of robotic surgeon? Do we have a 3D printer so that we can make the instruments we need and replacement parts? So you think about the future, and it's just limitless, the kinds of things that are going to happen. And I'll be honest, I don't think anything I've described is science fiction, right? I can't even imagine what it's really going to look like, but we have to do our best.
Yeah, and I guess what's happening too, which makes it really hard in some ways, is that you have exascale supercomputers coming out this year. That's a billion floating point operations per second. You have this thing called the Selene, which can do 5 exaflops applied to AI. The Frontier, which are coming out next year, which is 1.5 exaflops or billion floating point operations per second. I mean, can you imagine what that means in terms of molecular analysis, simulations, drug development, new material science? Or, I mean, Apple has this A14 bionic chip. So it's AI on the edge, it's in your phone.
Yep.
And it has 11.8 billion transistors. It's 5 nanometer technology, and it can do 11 trillion operations per second. I mean, what does that all mean? Or IBM just announcing their roadmap on quantum computing, and they're saying they are going to have 1,000 plus qubits working system by 2023.
Mhm.
or Honeywell saying they're going to double every year. What does that all mean? Maybe it's going to be so amazing with all of that computational capability that is perhaps beyond our imagination. So if you were now going to put your Philip Dick kind of sort of picture of the world, what if there were things that are unimaginable, but you are in the best place to imagine it, and it happened in the next 10 years? What would be that sort of vision of where medicine would be?
Yeah. So, I think that this incredible computational power is intersecting with our knowledge about how to do things like AI. We've always been limited because the data sets are too big and the computations are too complex. And all of a sudden, both of those things are going away really at the same time. And so we've got these tremendous data sets. And one of the things I think is really going to be happening over the next few years is the quality of that data is going to get better. Because there is the old garbage in, garbage out kind of problems. And if you look at healthcare in particular, some data sets are good, some have lots of voids. So we're going to start getting much higher quality data sets because essentially it's free to maintain them. There is no cost to storage anymore. I can get a OneDrive for $9 a month. I can have unlimited storage. Okay. Everything that I ever read, everything I ever write, I can store all of that for my whole life for $9 a month. Okay. Just amazing the amount of data we have at our hands. So you think about it, in terms of healthcare, the whole world becomes a clinical trial, right? We get a little bit more openness to healthcare conditions that are being treated, the treatments, the drugs that are used, the outcomes, and all of a sudden, instead of having to do separate kind of constrained clinical trials, you can look at real world data that tells you how patients with these conditions respond to these kind of treatments and what the outcomes are, right? And you think about the power of being able to do that, and there's some problems with that, right? We've got to figure out, this whole issue around privacy and access to data, and that's really kind of concerning right now to figure out how to deal with that. But we've got the ability through things like blockchain to create super hyper secure digital data stores. We just have to figure out how to make the regulations match the capability of the technology. Because I don't think we're going to be limited by technology moving forward. I think we're going to be limited by what we allow technology to do, right? There's no reasons now for our robots not to become more and more autonomous because we've got the computational power to make them that way. And we've got the ability to take these massive training data sets and really teach a robot how to interact with the world around it. I'm sure we've all seen the videos from Boston Dynamic, which are absolutely amazing, let me tell you. But I think that's just touching the surface of what robotics is going to be able to do in the future. And then you think about taking that and applying it to the human condition. And for me, when you think about amputees, for example, or people with neurological issues, we don't have a lot of tools right now to help them regain their autonomy. And yet we look at the potential of these tools, combining robotics and neural interfaces with a patient that has had an amputation of a shoulder or a leg or something like that, and recreating essentially one of the things from my science fiction past. We'll go back to that, the Bionic Man, right? This is now within the realms of possibility.
Yeah, or even producing sort of a sensor array to augment your retina or even replace it, right? And having
Mm-hmm.
high resolution on what you have, or the same thing with your hearing and so on. And so I guess
Well,
um,
they're doing that already. There are artificial retinas that you can implant that have been functional, and people have been able to see with them. So that kind of technology, the brain human or the brain computer interface is, we're right on the threshold of that. We know how to put electrodes in the brain safely. We're starting to learn how to interpret the data. We need a lot of computational power to figure out how to interpret the data, but it's kind of neat because if you want to, for example, control a prosthetic, it's part of that is knowing where to put the electrodes. But the other thing is that the brain is very plastic, and actually will retrain itself as well. So there's some amazing things that the brain is going to do that's going to partner with us in making these technologies really effective for the people that are using them.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, those Yamanaka factors and this idea of you can take a human cell and regress it to be a stem cell. And then, of course, you can coax it in some ways, like on the DNA methylation side or whatever. And at least in animals, you can sort of regenerate them, right? And it's that
Hmm.
careful sort of a point where you're not doing it too much, where you get all sorts of side effects, and yet you get life extension, or
Yeah.
or even sort of managing cell senescence, or I mean the possibility, or the telomeres, right? So I guess there's just so many frontiers that we're at the brink at, like literally on the
Hmm.
edge of amazing breakthroughs, and then you're immersed in all of that as well because of the position you have. So I can see where it's all, tremendously exciting. And I guess every day you just love going to work. Can you talk more about that experience of interacting with your colleagues? And then you may read a research paper and you go, wow, I didn't know that was going to come out next year. Or what is that
Yeah.
like?
So first of all, being at Mayo Clinic is kind of unique. I try to describe it like to folks, it's like you're playing on like you're part of a sports team. Okay, let's say you're part of the Lakers right now, and you go into work, and your job is to sweep the floor, and you might run into LeBron James today, right? That's exactly what it's like at Mayo Clinic, because our physicians, our surgeons, they are the LeBron James of the healthcare world. So you're working with that caliber of people. You're working with world class leaders in their fields, and that is just an amazing and inspirational thing. And it's really freeing and liberating in a sense too. If you don't have the sense that you have to do that too, but if you recognize that your job is to come along our world class physicians and researchers and help them be successful, you know that's just a tremendous way to approach this job. And then Mayo is such a collaborative place, right? Our staff are all working together. We recognize and respect each other's different expertise and things that we're able to bring to the table. So it's really fun to come together and solve a problem. And you got a physician that comes in and says, here's what I want to do to be able to better treat these patients, and really puts it in perspective, because you see the focus on the patient and what this innovation could do for them. And then you bring in the engineers, and the engineers have these ideas about how we could really implement that. And we bring in the computer science folks who can figure out how do we integrate all of this with our electronic medical record, or how do we apply AI in this. And so we've got all these resources to bring in, and people with incredible backgrounds. And it's just kind of an exciting environment, because you're constantly trying to figure out how to provide better care, how to better care for the patient, how to really innovate and create new technologies, things that don't exist. And it's really rewarding. um, but it's also not all about innovation. It's not. It's really about the patient at the end of the day. And really the pandemic, I think, has shown us that, right? Because for the last 6 months, our focus has not been on how do we innovate for the future, although the things we've done are helping us with that. Our focus has been, how do we keep our patients safe, and how do we keep our staff safe? And at the end of the day, that's the job of a healthcare organization, right? And that is job one. That's the most important thing that we do. And it's really fun to see an organization come together around that and focus strictly on that. How do we provide safe care for our patients? How do we keep our staff safe while we're doing this? So that's where the real reward comes in. It's back to our primary value. The needs of the patient come first, and we live that every single day. and that's the passion, and that's the secret sauce of Mayo Clinic. You know, it's what lifts all of us to be better than what we are on our own, is that kind of compelling value and mission.
You know, it just kind of reminds me, behind you, you got this rotating sign of safety.
Uh-huh. I do. Yeah. You know, we, as part of the pandemic, you know, we have asked our staff and our leaders to lead by example, right? Because we believe that, you know, we are a trusted source of healthcare information, and we want to lead by example. We want to show people, you know, the right way.
You have this other aspect of your career because you are at the hub of the innovation universe in medicine, right? Because of your position with the Mayo Clinic, and you, because of that, also in your all of your accomplishments, you're also a member of the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Amongst experts, you're a juror for Medical Design Excellent Awards, the RD 100 Awards, the Edison Awards. You're an advisory board with the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which is tied to the Imperial College London and King's College London. I mean, these are kind of like the apex of the world. What is that experience like? But because a lot of people don't get that opportunity.
Yeah, well, you know, certainly, you know, Mayo Clinic definitely opens doors. But I think it's just kind of the unique nature of the work we do, um, provides opportunities to really effectively participate in that. Because, you know, for 30 years, my job has been looking at new technologies, figuring out how to apply them, you know, trying to innovate and invent new ways of treating our patients or helping progress research. So that, you know, that really positions us well for, you know, participating in some of the awards programs and pitch competitions and things like that, because we're doing this and we're thinking about this all the time. And you know, your typical engineer ends up doing a job, but they don't have that exposure to really the innovation side. But you mentioned some of the advisory board positions. You know, I'm also on advisory board for my old engineering school, South Dakota State University, and you know, to me, that's a big part of what motivates me is as I get along in my career, how do I help mentor others? How do I help, you know, share the things that I've learned, so maybe somebody doesn't have to go through the exact same experiences. You know, this idea of giving back and sharing and helping to teach the next generation is huge. And you know, the King's College Advisory Board position is one of my, that's a new relationship that I have that I really love, because it's all focused around the combination of medicine and engineering, and how there's these synergies between them, and how together they can solve some of the really foundational healthcare problems that we're trying to address. So you know, a lot of wonderful opportunities, but it all builds on kind of the foundational work that we do day in and day out here at Mayo Clinic.
Yeah, but it'll also give you a front seat as to the emerging tech or the emerging disruptive, transformational innovations that are occurring. And you've talked about some of that. So that's a really interesting position you're in. Where do you see yourself personally now in the next 5 and maybe 10 years? Where do you want to go personally?
Yeah, well, so I do believe in serendipity. So I think, you know, you prepare yourself, but then you're open to what comes. You know, my focus right now, I have taken over as chair of engineering within the last year. My focus right now is on helping us figure out how do we come alongside our physician and research partners to best help them as we move to our 2030 strategic plan, as we try to redefine the way we do healthcare. You know, it's what kind of changes do we have to make to the engineering organization to support that? And you know, we're doing some fascinating things that involves some cultural change. It involves, you know, getting rid of some things that we used to do but aren't serving us now the way they used to, and finding out ways of moving into the future. So you know, a lot of these kind of strategic planning activities, But my love is execution. You can't strategic plan all day long. You have to execute, right? It has to come back to actually implementing these plans and making a difference. So we're making some changes to the organization, and that goes back to my love of strategic planning and culture and change management. And how do we create an engineering organization that's going to be able to keep up with the healthcare side of our organization. And you think about how healthcare is changing, and we've got to move fast too. And the message I keep hearing is agile and responsive and fail fast. And so we've got to figure out how do we create those kind of environments so that we have the ability to do that. Longer term, it's hard to say for me personally. Right now, I'm focused, over the next few years at really creating this organization that I have a vision for. And then again, it's, as I said, it's serendipity. You prepare yourself by doing the right things, by reaching out for opportunities, by taking chances, and you see what comes.
Yeah, and I guess it goes to the phrase, luck, that's where preparation and opportunity meet, right? So Vince Lombardi and sort of this philosophy of success. We're at this last question in our sort of dynamic chat. And what lasting thoughts would you like to leave the audience?
Um, I guess given where we are in the world today, I guess my lasting thoughts are really around the pandemic itself. This is something that we're going to come out of. We're going to come to an end, and the world will be different. But what's really going to be important about it is that in the interim we continue to maintain those relationships we have with people, that we continue to really listen to others, that we come out of this hopefully in a better place. We've had this combination of both the pandemic and then some social unrest, particularly in the United States since the murder of George Floyd. And I just hope that this has created a recognition that change occurs, and maybe there's some positive changes we can have to create maybe a better society, something that's a little bit more fair and just and equitable. That's my hope, is that at the end of this, we come out of it saying we went through some tough times, but we're in a better place. We're stronger, we're better, we're more unified, and people are treated more fairly and more equitably.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in today and sharing your deep insights, your global top tier experience. You're just so talented, and you're really shaping really the future of the planet and this planet reset. So again, thank you for coming in.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.